Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this very special evening. So we're, so proud to have David Miliband with us here. But the reason I invited him was because we're honoring the 25th anniversary of the IRC in Charlottesville. Our office opened here in 1998, and in that time, what's also kind of interesting from my point of view is that we've only had 2 executive directors in the office. We had our first director, Susan Donovan, for 12 years. I've been here for 13, so we've had a lot of continuity in the community. And in that time, IRCs resettled over 5,000 refugees in the urban area of Charlottesville. Thank you. And kind of looking at statistics, we know that about 10% of the population of Charlottesville and the urban ring of Albemarle County are immigrants, and we think probably about 40% of those are actually refugees that were resettled by IRC. So we know that the work we've done over this 25 years has a really visible impact on our community. I think a lot of you are here and you see people that we've worked with, kind of your neighbors, they're in school with your kids. We see them around in the community, and I think it's one of the strengths of the work we do in Charlottesville. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to introduce our moderator today, David LeBlanc. And David's the Ambassador Taylor Professor of Politics in the College of Arts and Sciences and Professor of Public Policy at the Batten School. He's also a faculty fellow at the university's Miller Center and a great friend of the IRC. So please join me in welcoming David LeBlanc.
Thank you, Harriet. It is a pleasure, and I speak on behalf of the University of Virginia, it is a pleasure to partner with the IRC. We have made efforts over the last half dozen years or so to do programming that brings together town and gown, to bring together the university and the community on topics that are of mutual interest to the folks who live here in Charlottesville. And so it is always an honor and a pleasure to work with the IRC, and we're absolutely thrilled to join with the IRC in this event. So let me just give a big thanks not only to Harriet and all the work that her team has done, but to UVA Global, to the Humanitarian Collaborative at the Batten School, to the Miller Center. So this is a Miller Center event, and everything that's happening is thanks to the enormous amount of work, effort, and talent of the folks at the Miller Center, especially Cristina Lopez Gutardi-Chow, who without her, none of us would be here today. Thank you to all of you for taking time out of your day, out of your evening to come with us to learn, right? To hear about the work that the IRC is doing and to hopefully walk out being, as Mr. Miliband promises, he's going to tell us how to stay optimistic during times of crisis. I was very fortunate to spend the day with David Miliband and to hear him engage with a variety of different groups, and he is an optimist, and he is a relentless optimist. And the work he does is important. It's important to our community. It's important to the global community, and we're really fortunate to have him with us. I could spend a lot of time giving you biography of David Miliband, but I think you'd much rather hear from him. So David Miliband is the president and the CEO of the International Rescue Committee. He is going to speak with us for a little bit. Then we will engage in a little bit of question and answer, a little bit of conversation, and then we will open up the floor for questions from the audience. So please join me in welcoming David Miliband.
Thanks very much. Thank you, David. Thank you very much, David, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming here tonight for what I hope will be an interesting conversation. And I emphasize both interesting and conversation, because I hope that as well as me talking for about 30 minutes, we'll get a chance to get to know each other a bit through question and answer. And obviously I want to start by thanking all of the sponsors. I won't rehearse them all, but I have had a very strong sense today of the way You said town and gown. That takes me back. I didn't know Americans talked about town and gown in that way, but the way in which the university and the town are really joined together in a very deep synthesis, and the way in which organizations like the International Rescue Committee in Charlottesville can be part of the coalition that's helping take the town forward, integrate new arrivals into the town, some of whom I met today from Syria and from Congo, from Burundi, from Honduras, from Afghanistan, and the way in which those people become contributors to the town, as well as members of the town, participants in the town's life. So I'm very grateful to you all for giving me this platform, and to be able to come and thank Harriet and her colleagues for the work they do. There are about 60 colleagues who work for the IRC in Charlottesville, and the fact that they are now, that they can say after 25 years that they've brought 5% of the population here, more or less, 4 to 5%, is pretty amazing, and speaks to dedication, professionalism, but also it speaks to optimism, actually. It speaks to optimism about the ability of people to start their lives afresh, help their kids begin life, and to become contributors. And really that's the theme that led me to my title tonight. I have to say that I couldn't have feared that my title would be as apposite as it is tonight. I'm not going to give a talk about the Middle East, but the horrific events of the last 5 days obviously weigh very strongly with me. They, I'm sure, weigh very strongly with you. And what I fear is that there is much worse to come. And certainly that's something that's on our minds at the International Rescue Committee, because we have teams in Lebanon, we have teams in Jordan, we have teams in Syria, we have teams in Iraq. We don't currently have programming in Gaza or in the West Bank or in Israel. So the title, sad to say, is extremely apposite, but I'm not going to be focusing on the situation in the Middle East, and obviously we can return to that in the question period. The fact that I'm talking both about Charlottesville and about the Middle East in the first 5 minutes of the talk tells you something important about the IRC. The IRC is actually unique in being both a global humanitarian aid agency and a refugee resettlement agency in the United States. And the link between those two aspects of our work is that we focus on people whose lives are shattered by conflict and disaster. And our mission, our rewritten mission in 2014, is to help people whose lives are shattered by conflict and disaster to survive, to recover, and to gain control of their lives. And we're able, because we have that focus, to develop technical expertise that I'm going to speak to tonight, a degree of experience that is comparative and historic, as well as contemporary. And I'm going to try and weave the story of the IRC with the story of global trends around crisis today. So there are 3 parts to the talk that I'm going to give over the next 25 minutes or so. The first is to talk about this age of crisis. What am I talking about? Is that just a bit of rhetoric, or how do we narrow the focus? The second is to talk about humanitarian action today and what we do. And then the third, the most difficult part, which of course has the least amount of time, is to talk about how to stay optimistic. And I'll explain why I've chosen that title a bit later on. Now, I think that if you put crisis into ChatGPT and ask the algorithm how many crises are going on today, what it will tell you is that there is a fervent debate in the academic world about whether we're living in an age of crisis or an age of polycrisis. There's books out about multi-crisis, perma-crisis. There's books about democratic crisis, about economic crisis. We're obviously living through a climate crisis. Just for those of you who are interested, the difference between crisis and polycrisis is that those who argue that we're living through polycrisis, their argument is that the multiple crises we're living through actually feed off each other and create a qualitatively different set of problems that we're going to face today. I'm not going to talk about that tonight. You'll be relieved to hear. I'm going to talk about humanitarian crisis. So it's a subset of this global agenda, but it's one that does bring together the political, the economic, the climate crises in various ways. And when I say humanitarian crisis, these are the figures that I'd like you to just have in your minds. And as you leave at the end, there will be a test on the figures, so I hope you're going to take careful notes. We're living at a time when there are 54 civil wars going on in the world today. It doesn't include the war in Ukraine, but and it's actually figures that came out before last weekend. We're living at a time when there are 110 million people around the world, 1 in 74 of the world's population, who have been forced by their homes by conflict or disaster. And within that 110 million, there are about 60 million or so who are displaced within their own countries. And there's about 40 to 50 million who have crossed a border as a refugee or as an asylum seeker. There are about 230 million people, so double the 110 million, who are facing what the United Nations called food insecurity. There's a 5-part scale of food insecurity in the world today. Not because there's lack of food, by the way, but because the food is not properly distributed. And there isn't equal purchasing power to access food. 240 million people or so who are at level 3 or above for food insecurity. Level 3 is you don't know where your next meal is coming from. Level 4 is malnourishment. Level 5 is famine. There's 360 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. So they depend on the aid sector for their survival. That's a 165% increase since 2018. And if you're interested in extreme poverty, that is now measured as people who are living on less than $2.15 a day. That's a World Bank figure. There's 630 million people living in extreme poverty today. Now, my point to you is that those figures of tumult in the form of war and displacement, those figures of hunger, those figures of poverty, they reflect crises of politics, of governance, of climate, and also of economy. We did a study, we published something called the International Rescue Committee's Emergency Watch List, which looks at the 20 countries most likely to have humanitarian crisis in the year ahead. And if you look at last December's edition, we said that more or less 70% of humanitarian need was caused by conflict, some of which has a climate dimension, 30% was climate and economic related. Now what I'm going to do in this talk is something of great danger, which is to try and use technology. And I come from the generation that, I didn't admit this to the students who I met today, some of whom are here, I recognize, but I didn't admit that I went to university before the age of the mobile phone, that is actually true. But I'm going to use the technology sparingly. You're not going to get a death by PowerPoint. There are 4 buttons on this. That leaves me in a quandary, but one of the buttons has a green dot on it. The one with the green dot is not the one that I have to press. But I want to show you one slide about the extreme poverty that exists in the world today. Let's see if it works. Yes, it does. I think this is a really interesting slide, because although the numbers of people in extreme poverty, this is actually not the $2.15, yes, this is the $2.15 figure. That's how you get to the 670 million figure. What this slide shows, it's a World Bank slide, what it shows is that there's actually 2 stories of extreme poverty in the world today. Story number 1 is that if you live in a fragile or conflict state, if you live in Somalia, if you live in Syria, if you live in Afghanistan, not only is there a rising number of people in those countries who are living in extreme poverty, but they are a rising share of the global extremely poor population. Because the second story that you can see is that in stable settings, the number of people in extreme poverty is falling quite dramatically. Now, China is a big part of that story. 500-600 million people in China have been taken out of extreme poverty in the last 30 years. But what I want you to take away from this is that what we're seeing is a story of extreme poverty that is increasingly concentrated in fragile and conflict states. In other words, the kind of places that the International Rescue Committee works in. We work in 35 countries. We're trying to increase our impact and scale. We will not do that by doubling the number of countries that we're working in. Because what I said about our expertise is working in fragile and conflict states. Now, I also want to say to you that those 20 countries I mentioned that are on the IRC's watch list, they account for between 80 and 90% of the extreme poor in the world. They account for between 80 and 90% of the refugees and displaced people in the world. And they also, they account in 3/4 of the cases for countries that are severely affected by the climate crisis. So the overlap between climate crisis and humanitarian crisis is growing and large. So, fragile and conflict states I want you to think about. Now, the next slide I want to show is about what's happening to the humanitarian aid sector. How are we doing in meeting those changing needs? This is quite a complicated slide, so I just want to pick out a couple of things. The red line shows you the level of need. The green line shows you the gap in funding between what's needed and what's available. Total humanitarian funding is the green line. Total humanitarian funding requirement, which is independently assessed by the United Nations, is the red line. And what you can see is that although funding is rising, the gap is growing faster. And that's why, or one of the reasons why, I think it is reasonable to talk about a rising tide of crisis. Because essentially, in the fragile and conflict states, there are more people in need. Their needs are more complicated than those in stable states. And the gap between what they need and what they're getting is growing. So I said I wanted to start by talking about the nature of the crisis. And I want you to try and accept that we're living, or that the people I'm talking about are living in an age of crisis. And it's a crisis that's compounded by the fact that the response to that crisis is decreasingly adequate to the scale of the need. Now, the third slide, before I have a break in the slides, is about how the humanitarian sector tries to meet those needs. And those are needs for survival, for recovery of women from violence, for basic education. Let's see if this one works. There we go. This is my world. Welcome to my world. I'm not going to go through every bubble here, but there's obviously a couple of important takeaways. The first is the affected communities are our clients are in the middle of this diagram, not just as a bit of rhetoric, but because I want them to be the center of the story. This is the world that they see around them. And these are people who are refugees from Syria in Jordan. They're people who are refugees from Sudan in South Sudan. They're people trapped in Afghanistan. They're Rohingya who've been either driven out of Myanmar and now in Bangladesh. And the truth is that the lucky ones make it to Charlottesville. But what we're seeing here is the lives of those who don't make it to Charlottesville. And I just want to pick out a couple of elements here. First of all, none of the bubbles surrounding them are very large because the reality that they face is of complex and competing systems operating around them. Relatively few refugees live in a refugee camp. Their lives are simpler than the rest. But you'll see here that if you look to the left of the central bubble, if you look at the UN agencies, they are notionally in charge of supporting the people who are in humanitarian need, but you can see they're only one bubble among many. If you look at 6 o'clock below the affected communities, international non-governmental organizations, that's the International Rescue Committee, amongst others. We also find this slide useful because it emphasizes the range of non-governmental actors that are important in the lives of the people that we're trying to serve, including diaspora groups around the world. And the truth is that this is a competing set of systems, not a single system. And because it's not a single system, it's more like a sector of activity. It doesn't serve the needs of the people well enough. A lot of good work is done in very difficult places, but the whole is less than the sum of the parts. And I just want to give you a sense of that. I'm going to ask the technical team, if I press the right-hand button again, will it go to the next slide or go to a resting slide? Okay, so I won't press it then. That's good. Okay, I'll hang on. I just want to dwell, this is the second part of what I'm talking about, this humanitarian sector. What does it do? How does it work? Etc. You need to think about $50 billion or so is spent in the humanitarian sector. My organization, the International Rescue Committee, is about a $1.6 billion organization today, so you can do the maths. We're about 3% of the total humanitarian effort. We've grown from being a $400 million organization 10 years ago to being a $1.6 billion organization today. I'm more proud of the fact that although we're only 3% of the global humanitarian sector, we do 30% of all the impact evaluations about what actually works in humanitarian programming. And I'm going to give you a flavor of some of that work today. An impact evaluation is an assessment of whether an intervention has a long-term impact on the lives of the people that it's intended for. I'll give you a sense of what we do. 40% of our work is in health, primary health care. So you can see it's a survival orientation. That includes water and sanitation. About 15% of our work is in education. I'm pleased about that. Overall, less than 3% of humanitarian funding is in education, which if you think that half of the displaced people in the world are children, that's an incredible compromise of their future. So 15% of our work is in education. 15% is livelihoods, supporting people's incomes. 15% is support and protection of women and children. 2/3 of our clients are women and girls. As I said, we're also the leading impact evaluation agency. We have about 110 people in our research and innovation unit because we're passionate about the fact that every dollar or euro or krona or yen that we raise needs to go as far as possible in having impact for the people that we're trying to serve. And what I thought I would do to describe the way we work is talk about 4 different areas of activity where we think we can have outsized impact. The first is going to be about malnutrition. The second is about information provision in the digital age. The third is about early childhood development, so education. And the fourth is about refugee resettlement here in the United States and some of the issues around asylum seeking that are in the news. So I'm going to start with malnutrition because it's the one that makes me most angry, but it's also the one where we've done the most amazing work. Have in mind that about 45 million under 5-year-old kids in the world today are acutely malnourished. That is a figure that operates at any one time. So in the course of a year, it's anything between 100 and 200 million kids under the age of 5 who are acutely malnourished. And as the famous scholar Amartya Sen said on the first line of his book about famine in 1981, famines are not caused by lack of food, they're caused by lack of access to buy food, or lack of ability to buy food. Of the 45 million kids who are acutely malnourished, about 20 million are in the fragile and conflict states that I talked about. The reason it's not more is that India still has a very big acute malnutrition problem. 80% of the acutely malnourished kids get no help at all at the moment, because the system for addressing their malnutrition is too complicated. It's too much based on getting kids to medical centers for 6 weeks running, and in too many of the places where we work, they can't do that. The good news is, over the last 7 years, we've developed a simplified approach for treating moderate acute malnutrition and severe acute malnutrition. The reason that 80% of kids don't get any help at the moment is that there are two different systems. One's for severe acute malnutrition, the other is for moderate acute malnutrition. UNICEF are responsible for severe acute malnutrition, World Food Programme for moderate acute malnutrition. Our simplified system says malnutrition is one disease. It has a single simple diagnostic tool, which is to measure the upper arm circumference. And our researchers have shown that if you give 2 doses of Plumpy Nut, which is a peanut-based paste, to any kid with an upper arm circumference of less than 115 millimeters, or 1 sachet to any kid with an upper arm circumference of less than 125 millimeters, you can have a 92% success rate in their recovery from the acute malnutrition. And those of you who are interested, there's a study in Mali of 27,000 kids who we trialed this community-based intervention on, and the results are really quite remarkable. So, that's malnutrition. It's a big focus for our activity. The second is about the provision of information. And we came to this for the obvious reason that when Syrians fled from Syria in 2015 and 16 and went to Europe and got onto boats to Greece, what was the first thing they do? They switch on their mobile phone. If you switch on your mobile phone in Greek, it comes up in Greek, which isn't very helpful if you're an Arabic speaker. And what we managed to do was develop an online tool for serving the information needs of refugees. And we've now spread it around the world. And I'm going to take my life into my hands by trying to show you a 2-minute video about the way in which this system works. It's called Signpost. The first click is not going to be the one that triggers the video, but the second one will. So,
information is power, and humanitarian information is no exception.
Now, if I click again, can we get the video going?
The international aid sector is there to help, but historically, delivering aid has been a one-way conversation. People fleeing crises often arrive in a new country where they don't speak the language and have to navigate a complex web of bureaucratic information that wasn't created with them in mind. That's why we created Signpost to decolonize humanitarian information. We meet clients on the platforms they already use to have two-way conversations in the languages they speak. We don't assume that we know what people need. We listen carefully and co-create information with communities to help them navigate their own journey through a crisis and exercise their human rights.
مرأة تواصلت ويانا هي أرملة فقدت زوجها بأحداث داعش اللي صارت مؤخرا للأسف.
Desde Infopalante le brindamos toda la orientación necesaria para que pudiese recibir atención psicosocial.
पाकिस्तान में कई ऐसे इलाके हैं जहाँ पर इंटरनेट जो है वो इतनी अच्छी तरह नहीं चलता और लोगों को
We are working to install Wi-Fi hotspots in Kakuma refugee camp to promote access to information.
Signpost is growing exponentially and now operates in 14 countries on 5 continents. Our goal is to provide contextualized humanitarian information wherever it is needed. Information is a human right. By empowering people in times of crisis, we safeguard their agency and dignity.
So that's Signpost. And there's two or three things that are interesting about it, I think. One is, the latest figures are that we've reached 70 million people through Signpost in the 14 countries that you've seen there. Second thing, we've got an expansion plan to reach 10 more countries over the next 3 years. Thirdly, and I think this is the most, in a way, the most interesting thing, if you'd said to me 10 years ago, let's build an information system for refugees, I think my instinct would have been to have tried to build a single system. The beauty of this, as you got, I hope you got a sense, even if you're sitting at the back, we deliver different instances of Signpost in different contexts. So in Jordan, it's different from El Salvador is different from Greece. And so we'll have, in those 14 countries, you've got 14 different instances of Signpost. I also want to relay to you that one of the beauties of it, is it okay on the, all okay? Yep. That one of the beauties of it is that it's run by refugees we employ who, in the most advanced form of it, are able to offer real-time information. If you're a woman on the run in northern El Salvador from a gang, and you can say, where can I find somewhere safe? Someone will answer, and there'll have been a previous woman on the run in northern El Salvador. So it's got a real sense of people helping each other, which I think is really important. Third example of what we do. Let's see if it goes on to the next one. Great. The Arabic on the top left says Alan Simsim, which is welcome sesame. And you may recognize my little friend here from Sesame Street. In 2016, Sesame Workshop, which is the charitable arm of Sesame Street program, and the International Rescue Committee bid to win the first MacArthur Prize for a $100 million investment in social change. And out of the 8,900 or so applicants, to cut a long story short, we won. And the promise we made was that we would deliver the largest early childhood development program in a humanitarian setting ever. I said earlier that 3% of the global humanitarian budget goes on education. A fraction of that goes on early childhood education. But what we know from Head Start in the United States, but also from programs in Europe, is that actually investment in kids at an early age has outsized impact on the rest of their lives. Now, over the last 6 years, we've been running this Alan Simpson program, including through COVID. And the numbers are absolutely extraordinary. Actually, I can update some of the numbers here. First of all, it was a two-pronged program. We had data that individualized help for kids could make a difference, but we couldn't scale it. That was the IRC contribution. Sesame had data that their TV program had educational benefit, but they couldn't personalize it. So we brought the two together. 25 million kids have watched the TV program. It says 1.83 million. By the end of the year, 3 million kids will have had in-person help, either through our teams or through their carers. And there are 3 impact evaluations of what we've been doing in Syria throughout the war, in Jordan and in Lebanon and Iraq, where the governments have actually backed it. I won't go through them all, but the most striking is that our pre-primary program using WhatsApp that targeted carers delivered a year's worth of pre-primary social and emotional learning and academic progress in the course of 11 weeks. So really an extraordinary level of progress. And the evaluation is not by us. The evaluation is by New York University, so it's completely above board in the way that it works. The final area that I just want to talk about where we've been trying to break the back of some of the blockages in the humanitarian system is in the United States. You'll know that we've had this refugee resettlement program for well, for 25 years here in Charlottesville, but for 40 or 50 years since the 1980 Refugee Act, 40 years, 43 years, across the country. More recently, our colleagues in the southern states of the United States have been working on the asylum seeker issue and how one deals with migration across the border. And I want to pick out one example of that. In Arizona, the state and the city of Phoenix came to us and said, look, we want to avoid asylum seekers being left on the streets, but we can't cope with them ourselves. What's your idea? And so we developed a case management system for asylum seekers who would have their legal status addressed, their health status addressed, their emotional state addressed, their family links across the United States assessed, and transport organized to meet their relatives in other parts of the country. In 2022, I haven't got this year's figures yet because we're not done, but in 2022, 55,000 people went through our welcome center in Phoenix. 98% of them were processed within 36 hours. And the state of Arizona says that not a single person has been left on the streets of Arizona during that process. So in all this time, when people say that the migrant crisis has been unmanageable, our colleagues in Arizona have shown there's actually a way to manage it. And that, I think, goes to the heart of the common denominator of the four examples that I've given you. While it's tempting to dwell on the suffering, it's really important to focus on the solutions. And in our advocacy, in our fundraising, and obviously in our programs, what we focus on is the solutions. Evidence-backed, outcome-oriented solutions. And that leads me to the last part of what I want to talk about tonight, which is where does the optimism come in? The reason I chose this is that the question I've been asked more often than anywhere else than any other in the last 10 years, and I was asked it again today by the students of the public policy program, is how do your teams stay optimistic in the face of the crisis that they're facing? Now, the answer I always give is, if you look at the statistics, you get depressed. If you look at the people, you have hope. And I actually do buy that. There's no doubt in my mind that there's energy and there is even optimism and there is even hope in some of the most tired and distraught and distressed eyes that we see around the world. And it's worth saying, since I'm in front of a partly academic audience, there's also quite a lot of evidence led by a man called Steven Pinker, who's a professor at Harvard, that actually if you look at the statistics, things aren't getting worse, they're getting better. But they're not getting better in the fragile and conflict states. But what I want to do tonight, and humor me if you will, is to pick out 3 lessons that I think are important to IRC teams in keeping them optimistic in times of crisis. This is 3 things I've learned by watching them in the last 10 years. The first is what I call the bias to action. If you stare at the problem, never mind admire the problem, you certainly will get depressed. If you try and do something, it's a source of learning, it's a source of energy, it's a source of hope. And 33 million people were helped by that bias to action on the part of my colleagues over the last year, because that's the number of people that we helped in our operations around the world. The second is, I used to be in government, and governments have many strengths, but risk-taking is not one of them. If you want to stay optimistic in times of crisis, you have to have a strategic decision to embrace risk. And I want to give you one example of that. We have something we call our innovation fund, run through our research and innovation unit. And it's very countercultural, this, to me, but when I go to the philanthropists who fund our innovation fund, the question they ask is not surprising, but the answer is. The question they ask is, what's your failure rate in your innovation fund? That's not particularly surprising. What's surprising is that they want the failure rate to be high. Because if you're not failing, you're not thinking radically enough about the solutions. If you were only concerned with not failing, you'd have set up signposts as a global system. If you were only concerned with not failing, you wouldn't have brought together Sesame Workshop and International Rescue Unit. If you were only concerned with not failing, you wouldn't have tried a welcome center in the middle of Phoenix. So the bias to action has to be allied to a willingness to take risks. Just in all transparency, our failure rate is about 40% in our innovation fund, and our funders want it to be higher to show that we're really ready to take risks. Not take risks with people's lives, but take risks with things that might work. And the third element that I think is important in sustaining hope is that our teams and our clients want to see us speaking truth to power. They want us, when we bear witness to a bombing of a case close to home. 2 of our staff were killed in northern Syria when the ambulance they were driving had a missile targeted at it by a Russian Air Force jet. They want us to speak in outrage and in witness of what happened. And that's controversial in the humanitarian sector because we're not political, and we don't stray into party politics, and we don't stray into partisan politics. But one definition of impartiality is that you don't call out the bad actors. I think it's a really important part of our job to call out the bad actors. And where we're on the ground and we've got evidence, we've got to speak to it. So when I think about the title of the talk and how to sustain, if I can get it back, the co-sponsors come back. If I think about the title of the talk and how to support and sponsor and develop optimism in times of crisis, I think about a bias to action, I think about a willingness to take risks, and I think about a duty to speak truth to power. Let me just finish on the following note. I think I've gone on slightly longer than the 30 minutes I promised. I'm sorry, David. In my experience, big change happens when 3 things come together: government leadership, business and NGO innovation, and mass mobilization. But what I've learned is they don't always come in that order. And we're living at a time when governments around the world are actually retreating from big problems. They're not marching to find big solutions. And so my lesson is that NGOs, in partnership with businesses and non-profits like universities, we need to step up and find the solutions. And that's what defines the work of the IRC today. That's actually what defines the lifeblood of optimism and hope. And it's what makes our jobs worth doing, because we can see the benefits. So I hope I've given you an insight into that tonight. I hope I've given you some provocation. I hope you remember the statistics, and I very much look forward to your questions. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you, David. I'm actually quite surprised, all right, because when you began, I thought there's no way I'm going to be optimistic at the end of this talk, right? There's no way. How are we going to begin by talking about what's happened over the last 5 days, and then me come up here and ask some questions in a way that's really optimistic? And so I really love the frame of talking about a bias to action, and especially a willingness to take risk in a university town and in a place that is committed to seeking knowledge and to educating one another. The idea of a willingness to take risk is something I think it's good for you to remind us of, and it's something that university, town and gown, public and private can work together on. I have a few questions, and we will take questions from the audience, and if you're online, please submit your questions online, and we will address them as we can. I want to ask you kind of some broad questions about this willingness to take risk, and it has to do with how does the IRC decide where to do its work, right? So again, you talked about there's an IRC watch list. You talk about signposts in a set of countries. You talk about the different states where the IRC is working. There's so many crises, as you said, whether it's environmental or civil conflict or state repression. What are the decision rules that you
Yeah.
use to decide where, I hate to say set up shop, but,
Yeah.
but to where to spring
That's a
into
great
action?
question. So there are two parts of the answer to that. One part is very dominant, and the other part is less important or less important at the moment, but we're trying to make it bigger. The big truth is I'm not sitting on $1.6 billion and deciding where to spend it. We're raising $1 billion, $1.1 billion, from governments who decide we want to do this work in Pakistan, we want to support this work for refugees in America, we want to sponsor this program for education in Yemen. And our decision there is not where to spend the money. Our decision is, do we bid for that contract? And for that, we have very clear entry and exit criteria for places that we work. And we have a decision rules, which I think is a very good phrase that you use, where our country programs assess needs on a rolling 3-year basis, decide what their signature outcomes are going to be, and therefore what grants they're going to apply for. So if the Yemen team has highlighted education as a gap that needs to be filled, and we're the right people to fill it, they'll bid for that education contract. Now, we have about $500 million that comes from individuals, corporates, and foundations. The corporates and foundations, basically, they decide where they want to spend the money. But that leaves what we call our unrestricted funds, and we're down to about $60 million that is actually fungible in the end, that is available for programs once you, maybe 70 this year coming. Our fiscal year starts on the 1st of October. Now, for that money, I have to go back to our mission statement, which is about helping people to survive, recover, and gain control of their lives. And if survival is at stake, they've got to get the money first. And so we hold money back to make sure that if the crisis in Sudan develops in the way that it does, that we can make a difference in somewhere like that.
So then I'll return to, again, something you said at the beginning. What would, and I hate to use the word compel, what would draw the IRC to work in Egypt, right? To set up in the Sinai, assuming that people are leaving Gaza through that exit. So I don't want to ask you the politics question in terms of side, but I want to ask you the question of at what point in time would you say, okay, this is where we're going?
We have a classification system of need, so that's the first point. We secondly do an assessment of who else is there. So where there are local or international actors who are already doing the job, we won't go, because we don't go to duplicate. Okay. Thirdly, we ask, is it feasible for us to set up shop, to use your phrase? And does that mean direct delivery or work through partners? Because that's an important part of this. And fourthly, can we do it within the confines of the legal and other parameters that we operate within as a US registered NGO? Because obviously we've got to follow local law, and we've got to follow US sanctions legislation and the like.
So you have to be responsive to whatever law in the country you're working with.
Yeah.
Okay. And so in that regard, to what extent or how do you work with local governments in case, let's say you have people in Honduras or in Guatemala or in Sudan, what kind of intelligence do you get from what entities so that you can protect your people?
So that's a great point. We don't protect first of all, we don't send squads of people from New York or from Charlottesville. Our international staffing is very small. Of a total employee base of about 24,000, we have about 550 international staff. So the 96%, 98% of our staff are recruited locally. So in northwest Syria, we're recruiting Syrians. We've got 5,000 people working for us in Afghanistan. We have 4,996 Afghans working for us. So these are people who are not being helicoptered into a community, it's their community. And that's an enormous source of credibility, legitimacy, sustainability, and intelligence, because they know what the lie of the land is. You mentioned governments. There was an interesting question about this from the students today. Some governments are governments of states that are legitimate and recognized in the United Nations. Some of them are elected, some of them are not elected. Some of them are despotic, and some of them are democratic. We have to deal with all of them, and we have to use our smarts to navigate our way through. But I don't want to hide from you, we also work in places where non-state actors are the government. Northwest Syria is a good example of that. In Afghanistan, there are quote-unquote de facto authorities who are not recognized by the UN, otherwise known as Taliban. We have to work that because of the needs. And we have to navigate that by sticking to those humanitarian principles that I mentioned, and by planting in the mind of the governors the seed that says, hang on, these people are valued by the local population. Do we really want to get on the wrong side of the local population by hassling these people? That's actually our best defense.
So let me, I'm going to ask one more question, and so again, if folks have questions in the audience, get ready to come and ask. I want to ask a question about advocacy. One of the things that you mentioned when we spoke earlier today was your, I will characterize your statement as largely disappointed in the UK government's approach to asylum, and I think we began having a conversation about, is the age of asylum over, right? We see what's happening on the southwest border of the United States. We see the rollback in asylum processing that occurred during Trump and continues during Biden. We see interdictions across the Mediterranean. So can you talk about both what you see from your perspective in terms of the asylum regime that had been in place since 1949, and then what role does the IRC and other NGOs play in trying to support an asylum regime?
Well, first of all, I think there's a substance part of the question and there's an advocacy part of the question.
Yeah.
The 1951 Refugee Act, or United Nations High Conventional Refugees, established for European refugees the right not to be sent back to danger. That was then made global in 1967. It was put into US law in 1980. And it says that anyone who claims asylum can't be sent back into danger without due process or can never be sent back into danger, and they're allowed due process to establish whether or not they are in danger. The regime, as you call it, is not static because it's been interpreted by states and by courts over the last 70 years. And so to give you one, I think, really interesting example, 50 years ago, a woman on the run from El Salvador would not have been considered an asylum case. Now she is. And I think that's right because she's not safe if she goes back. Now, so the substance has changed. It's also changed that there's much more economic migration, and there's many more grey areas between people who are fleeing for their lives and people who are fleeing for a better life. Climate change is only going to exacerbate that. It's going to blur the distinction between someone who's, if you're on the Marshall Islands, you can say I'm fleeing for my life. But for most people, there's going to be a greyer area between fleeing for your life and fleeing for a better life. So there are difficult substantive issues. There's then an advocacy question. I still believe that it is possible for rich states to process asylum claims and decide who meets the test, who doesn't meet the test, to integrate those who do meet the test and to send back those who don't. Now, at the moment, that is under severe strain. In the United States, it takes 18 months to get a work permit and 5 years to get your case heard if you're claiming asylum. In Germany, in 2015-16, they had 1.5 million asylum seekers. It took them 6 to 9 weeks to process a claim. Delayed justice is no justice. Delayed justice is a disaster in this area. But I don't believe the argument that it's impossible to process the claims. One reason, by the way, that it's possible to process claims is that most people seeking asylum are not in rich countries. 80% of the world's refugees are in poor countries, not in rich countries. It's probably 75% now, I think, because of 5 million Ukrainian refugees have gone to Europe, and Europe is obviously rich. Europe has actually welcomed them. So I would say that the South Sudans of this world, they've got an open border for people coming from Sudan. So has Chad actually got an open border for people coming from Sudan. Those countries need economic help, but they don't want to process the claims. I'm not prepared to accept the argument that rich countries can't run an effective asylum system, which is essentially the argument that's being put by the UK government. I also think that tactically, anyone who believes that opening up the 1951 Convention to make it better is going to get the shock of their lives, because the trend will be to make it worse, not make it better. We've got good laws that protect people in the most extreme circumstances, and I think we've got to try and rally behind them.
Is it, so if you think we're not going to, again, if we go back to 1951 and we use the language, right, we take the language from the convention, which is well-founded fear, right? Your suggestion then is that we're going to ratchet down what constitutes well-founded or fear part of this.
I mean, look, the language is very old-fashioned. Well-founded fear of persecution. And you could say, well, that's designed for the Cold War, right? It's not designed for a civil war in Syria or a civil war in Somalia. Now, the truth is that although that's the legal language of origin, the court cases have developed case law that is able to stay more up to date. And the example of the woman on the run from El Salvador speaks to that. My point is that should be the case. If you have a well-founded fear for your life, you shouldn't be sent back to where you came from. And it's not beyond the wit of advanced societies to establish systems with appropriate representation and due process for each individual to get that case heard.
So, are there questions? Because I could go on for a while, right?
There's a microphone here if people want to come up to the front. I see people are online.
All right, thank you, Alfred. All right, so this is an online question. How do you expect the IRC to be affected by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Well, there we go. We're out of the gate. We're out of the gate pretty early.
Well, we're as surprised as anyone else by what happened on Saturday, and as appalled as everyone in this room, I'm sure. We are in the process of assessing the situation in Gaza, in the West Bank, and across the Middle East where we work already, in Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Syria. And so I don't want to say what we expect. What I can say is that we are examining all possible scenarios for displacement and for humanitarian need, and assessing with diligence what we could do to mitigate the humanitarian loss. And it's a matter of scenario planning rather than expectations. And obviously we've got a situation where there are many, many moving parts, both within the region and globally, that we have to be aware of. And we're trying to navigate that.
With respect, you sounded like a politician in answering that question. And I know you were.
That means it was a very good answer.
Can you spin out for us a scenario where you would say, and this is you speaking on your behalf and I guess on behalf of the IRC, what would be something where you would say we need to be on the ground?
Well, where there's need.
But tell me again, demonstrably.
Yeah, so where there are people who need our services, or need our cash, or there are organizations that need our technical expertise, that counts as need.
Okay.
We then ask, is anyone else better positioned to do it than we are? We then ask, is it legally possible for us to do it? And then we ask, can we fund it? So that's the process that we go through. And it's got to be needs driven, because we're an impartial, neutral organization. And it's got to have objective criteria that assess it, and our classification system does use objective criteria.
Yeah. I know we have a question from this gentleman right here.
Mr. Miliband, thank you for your talk. My question's in regard to your experience in government and to the role of government. Having been out of Parliament for almost 10 years, how far do you feel Britain acted in self-interest on the global stage instead of as an arbiter of global peace? And do you feel nations should be obliged to act in self-interest following the electorate, or should they act for the greater good?
Thanks. So this is back to my old job a bit. I mean, I think that the injunction I would give is that countries must abide by international law in how they act, because that is the discipline on their self-interest. And of course, the first responsibility of government is to protect and support and advance the interests of its own citizens. That's what it means to be a national government. I would argue that countries have waxed and waned in the extent to which they've had strategic intelligence about the impact of their actions abroad for their interests at home. And the debate in America is different than the debate in the UK. You're a superpower, the UK is not a superpower. It's a different global perspective. But at its best, I would say that the US has shown strategic insight in the way that it's led globally since the Second World War. And at its best, the UK has as well, but in a different role. Now, we're not always at our best.
That didn't sound like the end of the statement. There's somebody had a hand up back here. If you would come up to the mic, please.
My name is Tracy. I've worked in a lot of different humanitarian responses because of public health crises, war, whatever. I think one of the questions I have is, what happens in these crises a lot is everybody wants to jump in, right? All of the NGOs are flocking in all at once. There's not great coordination of efforts, and consequently, not always gets a lot done that is helpful. The second problem is when another crisis occurs, everybody's bugging out. What happens to sustainability? So I guess my question is really, how do you prevent those things from happening where a crisis occurs, all the NGOs flock in, nobody really is coordinating the efforts, and then people leave without leaving something behind in that particular area?
So that's a really great question. Let me just address it directly. First of all, I've learned a few things over the last 10 years. One of the things I've been most impressed by is local coordination. Actually, the global coordination, as you saw from the spaghetti diagram, is not great. But local coordination is pretty good. It's organized not just by place, it's organized by sector. So there's a health cluster, there's an education cluster, there's a women's protection cluster. I honestly can tell you I've never had a case where we've ended up going somewhere to do something and have fallen over another NGO doing the same thing. So the deconfliction is actually locally pretty good. It's a much bigger problem that resources are spread too thin, not that they're doubled up. Secondly, although we do respond to emergencies, we respond to emergencies from within the country, not from outside. And this has been a massive change in the last 20 years, that the countries most exposed to crisis are those already in crisis. So the Pakistan floods, we respond to the Pakistan floods not from New York, we respond from Islamabad. And I think I'm very proud of this, that our emergency response is much less about a global surge team and much more about local training of your finance staff, your HR staff, your education. They're all ready to redeploy. We've got that at the moment. Where was I on the... Yeah, I mean, Afghanistan, we've got 5,000 people. There's an earthquake. The donors say you can via your money into different areas. We don't have to send the team from externally. They've been trained locally to respond to the earthquake. So there's real local capacity for that. And the cluster system actually does, and the UN deserves credit for its role in this, in our experience, works pretty well.
So talking about, as we're waiting for the next question, talking about localities, how does IRC choose, and maybe choose is the wrong word, how does IRC coordinate with and choose localities? So again, think about Charlottesville, right? How do you choose the communities that you're going to work with locally in the United States in terms of resettlement?
Well, as with many things, the United States is different. And so in the United States, the State Department say, we want you to resettle, this year, 19,000 people. And we want you to do it in the following, and there's a maximum that you can do in any one locality. So they urge us to set up new localities, and we go with proposals to them. So we now have a sub-office in Richmond, so we've got 2 offices in Virginia. And we are opening sub-offices in, I think there's a sub-office being opened in Iowa, there's a sub-office being opened in Kansas. So it's different from elsewhere. So the US, I mean, it's actually a good thing. The federal government wants to make sure there's a spread of refugees across the country.
So just compare it to another country. I mean,
Well, we don't do refugee resettlement in quite the same way in any other country, because 50% of the world's resettled refugees basically come here.
US.
And so the refugee resettlement operation we've got is bigger in the US than anywhere else. The closest would be Germany, where we work in a different way in Germany. In Germany, you've got, you see, in the US, you've got this public-private partnership. You've got the government and you've got the NGOs. In Germany, it's a much more state and church-run effort, state and civil society effort. And so our support there is to give technical support in two areas. One, labour market entry for refugees, and secondly, education for refugees and helping them in school. So we're supporting 1,000 schools, I think, we've supported across Germany in how to integrate Syrian refugees into their schools.
I mean, that is really quite astonishing if you think about that scale.
Yeah.
Right. I certainly understand how you can walk away with at least some optimism.
Well,
in this regard.
At least we're doing something. Yeah.
Yeah, Elizabeth.
So in the past, we've resettled refugees through these through the resettlement agencies, but I understand that there's opening up some room for sponsorship for sort of a different model. So is that something that's going to expand what we're able to do, or is it a way for the government to kind of get out of the resettlement game?
Very interesting question. We're actually in favor of diversifying the roles in the refugee resettlement business. That may seem like it's against our interest, but we think it's the right thing to do. Here's the model. In Canada, I'm now too short-sighted to see you, but in Canada, 7% of the population have been involved in resettling refugees. And it's avowedly designed to create a national movement. And now in the United States, the current administration has said that they want to support an American variant of model. You'd never, in this country, copy exactly something from somewhere else. You don't like imports of any kind. But the administration is trying to learn from that, not in a cookie cutter approach, but in what I would call a biscuit cutter approach. In a cookie cutter approach, they are trying to learn, and so they're setting up sponsorship arrangements. Here's the thing. It's hard to resettle refugees. It's doubly hard when there are mental health and a range of other issues that people are bringing with them. It takes real professionalism, and it takes real determination and commitment to follow through when the going gets tough. And that's why we think there needs to be a combination of community sponsorship and some form of professional resettlement expertise that goes alongside. But you're right, that this is being, Harriet, do you remember what it's called? The Welcome Corps is the American version of the Canadian model, and we're pro it. We think it's a good thing.
Question? And then are you waiting as well? Okay.
Thanks for your time today. My question, in reflecting on your concluding remarks about the power and importance of partnership, was wondering if you could reflect on the partnerships you're not seeing but you would like to see and that you think could be really impactful and bring more resources to bear.
Partnerships to bring more resources.
More resources and capacity to bear. One that especially comes to mind, given the interrelated nature of the crises, is the environmental conservation sector.
Yeah. I mean, the partnerships that we're pursuing most at the moment are local partnerships in the places that we work with, especially with women-led organizations, actually, to try and tackle some of the gender inequalities that our clients face. But they're not going to bring resources, unfortunately. Those local organizations are rich in intelligence and capacity, but not in financial resources. In terms of bringing new finances, we do have I think, a real responsibility to join and align the humanitarian financing and the climate financing, which at the moment live in very separate worlds. When you think about the future of the World Bank, if I think about Pakistan, we're a $35 million program in Pakistan. The World Bank is a $15 billion enterprise in Pakistan. Their resources are not perceived as humanitarian, but they're often doing humanitarian good in education or women's protection, etc. And I think that when it comes to public resources, the multilateral finance system is very, very important, especially given that the climate crisis is disproportionately affecting poorer parts of the world. Now, there's also private resources. Philanthropy, foundations, private sector. And those resources, I think, are partly employee giving, which is increasingly important for us. They're partly philanthropic, but they're also about resources of brain power. I didn't have time to go into it, but the signpost, one obvious question about it, well, is it secure? If I'm a woman on the run, how safe is it? Well, the cybersecurity has been designed by the experts actually from one of the major companies, and they did that by giving us 6 weeks of work of some of their top people. So that's actually a pretty big donation in kind that has outsized influence for us, and we've got to think what can make us a good partner for some of those private sector players. Thanks a lot for the question.
All right. I'm sorry, we have this young lady over here is probably going to be our last question.
Yes, and cheers to Charlottesville and the newcomers and the IRC team for the 25 years. My question kind of dovetails on a few of these. You talked about government leadership and business and mobilization. A question I have and for your insight is like, as you're doing this mobilization or what have you, like, how do you make sure that they also like understand the government, leadership or business, or is like part of that mobilization, mobilizing them to effect, or are we just, mobilizing communities as well, which is needed?
So that's such an interesting question, and the basic answer is I don't know the answer to that, so I'm sorry to end. That's not a great answer to end with.
But the perfect answer.
I think what I would reflect is you can't control a mobilization. By definition, it's got its own organic strength. Secondly, there's mobilization in this community to support refugees. That's a big thing. In some ways, it's a model. And mobilization feeds off itself. I've seen that even in the conversations that I've had today. Now, it was very, very interesting after the withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021. There was a remarkable mobilization of people saying, hang on, America can be better than this. And harnessing that mobilization is very, very significant. After the invasion of Ukraine, there was a real mobilization, and what Europe did in the course of the weekend after the 24th of February was extraordinary. They offered the biggest refugee boost that's ever been offered anywhere. You can get into arguments, would it happen if it wasn't, why Ukrainians, not Syrians? Those are all good questions. But I think that the mobilization is about seizing the moment. That's really the thing, and then building sustainable networks, because that's, and without wishing to just blow smoke, the role of a university of standing has the capacity to do that in a way that I think is a real anchor that's very, very important. Thank you.
So let me wrap up by first thanking Harriet and the IRC for partnering with us. Let me give deep thanks to my friends and colleagues at the Miller Center for making this event possible. Let me thank all of you for coming out, and thank you so much, David, for spending time with us this evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right.